Lightbearer, The Crimson Chronicle, Part 1. Written by J.A. Hawk. Read for you by Joshua Garner. Chapter 20. The Sky Temple. Fate slowly opened her eyes to an intense feeling of vertigo. Her foggy brain did not immediately understand where she was, or why she felt a firm pressure at her midriff. After a second of confusion, she realized she was hanging at the end of a tether, suspended 4 feet above the ground and swinging slightly from side to side. She looked up. The twisted wreckage of the sky darter was dashed to pieces around the mangled remains of an ivory building. Fate groaned. She twisted around the best she could with the rope cutting deeply into her stomach. She grabbed the tether with both paws and pulled downwards, and though the pressure eased on her middle for a moment, the knot about her waist still held fast. She jerked down on the rope, trying to dislodge it from whatever snag it had hung on. Again and again she applied her meager weight to the effort, but the result was a skinny rabbit bobbing in the air like a burrowing's toy. "Come on!" Fate yanked the rope with heated frustration, but she only bounced more frantically. In a determined effort, she gritted her teeth and tried to haul herself up, paw over paw, but with the way the rope was tied around her, she could not summon the upper body strength to manage it without her legs to help. After a straining grunt, she was forced to let go and drop to the bottom of the tether with a bump. Helpless, she hung there dangling, trying to catch her breath while looking around. The debris and wreckage of the sky darter was flung in every direction. It was a chaotic landscape, and a sudden desperation came over her. "Fletch?" she cried to the night. "Felix? Somebody. Anybody." A loud sound from above caught her attention, wood and crumbling masonry being shifted roughly. Fate looked up to see 2 disheartened ears upon a ginger head, covered in white dust, peek over the edge of what had once been part of the sky darter's deck. "Fletch," Fate said hopefully. "Thank goodness. Are you okay?" Fletch crawled to the edge of the deck and slowly collapsed, his tired arms hanging over the side as he looked down at her. "You look ridiculous," he said. "Oh, stuff it," Fate sniped back. "I'm trapped. Come down and help me." Fletch half-heartedly lifted his head, examined his surroundings, then replied, "Just a mo." With a grunt of weary exertion, the fox slowly got to his feet and disappeared from sight. Fate continued to look upward, trying to see what he might be doing. There was a swift patter of paws upon what remained of the deck, followed by a flash of ginger fur as the fox cleared a gap between the sky darter and a once handsome building, now marred and destitute after being hit by the breeze skimmer. There was a crash, and the sound of breaking glass. For the first time, Fate noticed the building they had crashed into. It had 2 stories, and the front door was only a few feet away. Somehow it made her situation feel all the more foolish. "Hung like a parcel to be picked up later," she thought bitterly. More bumbling and crashing noises came from inside the building, as if a war lion had been let loose with a bee in its mane. Thunk, crunch, crash, thud. Then a loud bang came directly from behind the door next to Fate. Unwillingly, it partially cracked open. More grunts of exertion, a colossally large thud, and the ivory building finally released Fletch, along with a plethora of books, papers, and everyday detritus which scattered in every direction, bouncing across the cracked cobblestones. The metal hull of the temple sky vessel could be seen peeking from beneath the paved way when the pale moonlight caught it just right. "Seems like they're out today," Fletch commented, dusting himself off and glancing over his shoulder at the bedraggled building. Fate spun around slowly at the whims of the slight breeze. A sly grin crested Fletch's angular face. However, the fox had enough tact to not say anything more and moved quickly over to her. He wrapped his arms around her bottom and legs and braced them tightly. Then he handed his small camp knife up to Fate. "Ready?" he asked as she grasped the rope. "Now!" He lifted upward onto his tiptoes. With the pressure lessened, and Fletch's help, Fate finally righted herself. She reached up and sawed at the rope with the knife, cutting herself free. Quickly she reached out and had to grasp with her free arm around Fletch's head and shoulders, flattening his poor ears down roughly as her weight was thrust upon him. He carefully lowered her down. Fate's legs were numb and completely unstable as she hit the ground, after having hung for so long with little to no circulation. Swaying, she clung to the front of Fletch's jacket, and they stood arm in arm for a moment as blood sent icy pinpricks racing through her legs, bringing them back to life in uncomfortable fashion. In the silence, the crackling of fire and the touch of soft breezes were the only things present. "Oh no! Felix!" Fate said suddenly, twisting around as far as she could while holding on to Fletch. "Did you see Felix anywhere?" A horrible feeling began to well up inside Fate, as if a dam was readying to burst. The terrible events preceding their landing began to flood through her mind, flashing before her eyes like an awful dream. She looked up at the fox and asked, "Fletch, you don't think he... Her lip trembled as tears threatened to burst forth. "Like... Edek?" Hey, Fletch said softly. "Easy now." He embraced Fate tightly as tremors began to rack through her body. He held her, knowing exactly what she needed. And once the shakes had subsided, he said, "Look, over that way." Fate peeked from beneath his enfolded arms as he motioned towards more wreckage cast far in the distance. "It seems we're missing half the ship," he said. "This is only the front bit, and Felix was at the stern, if you recall. We need to find where the other half landed." Fate gained a modicum of control over herself at those words. Fletch was clearly ready to set forth, but Fate needed his embrace a bit longer. "Did you know," she asked, stalling, "that Edek could do that?" Fletch looked down at Fate, who was resting her head on his chest. "No," he admitted. "I always knew he was a blowhard, but, well, it certainly brings a new meaning to the word, I'd say." Fate gave a small chuckle and pulled gently away from Fletch. "That he certainly was," she confirmed. "We really should have found out more about him." "He wouldn't have answered us properly anyhow if we had," Fletch said in a dour tone. "No, probably not." Fate took a deep breath and turned away, looking at the destruction. "I wonder if my bow survived." As it turned out, Ivy had survived the crash. They found it tangled in a cargo netting, dangling precariously over a fragment of burning rubble. Once they had cut free the longbow, Fate was glad to find the string was still intact and useful. However, her quiver had lost most of the lightweight arrows with the acorn-shaped heads. They fished around the wreckage and were able to find a pawful, but it still made her very nervous to have so little ammo, with not knowing what might await them. To her disappointment, and after a thorough search of the Skydarter's wreckage, Fate's short sword was nowhere to be found. Thankfully, Fletch had retained Swan, and that was something. Once they had canvassed the area around the wreckage for as long as they dared, they made a calculated guess. If they were to find Prince Felix, alive, dead, or injured, he could have only been thrown in one direction, inward, towards the direction their skimmer was headed when they had hit the massive vessel. The central part of the vessel held a cluster of buildings that broke the skyline strangely with their tattered and morose-looking roofs. True craftsmanship had been employed when hiding the ship's hull beneath stone and brick, but after the colossal upheaval of the sky vessel from the earth, its mechanical nature could now be seen behind every shadowed nook and cranny as its facades had fallen away. The perilous edge of the sky vessel, a jagged split of stone pathway that ended abruptly and plunged out into nothingness, had made them very nervous, and they were eager to move away from the dark abyss. Their way was obstructed by broken mortar let free from the buildings, broken shingles, shards of glass, and upturned, cracked cobblestones all strewn about the path. Thus, carefully they set off towards the inner part of the temple, highly aware that the ground upon which they trod might actually be false. Fate still had a hard time wrapping her head around the magnitude of this sky vessel, despite the fact that her feet walked upon its very hull. As they went along, they passed shadowed mounds that lay upon the ground. Fate had glimpsed these figures from aboard the Sky Darter, and she wanted nothing more than to pass by the specters unaccosted. But as a lodestone draws metal to it, Fletch went to the nearest form. He knelt down next to the body, slowly reached out and turned it over. A rabbit with wide, round eyes stared up at them. It wore a padded jerkin over which a short half-shirt of chainmail rested. The terrible wound which had ended him looked like a hole, and something seemed to have seared its way clean through his chest. The rabbit's mouth was still slightly agape with shock. Fletch reached out and tried to arrange his features to a more tender expression, but rigor mortis had set in, and those accusatory eyes remained open, never blinking. Fletch sighed heavily and rose to his feet, pulling with him a round shield that lay next to the soldier. "Landoran," he said, turning the dark face of the shield with the great tree emblem towards Fate. "It would seem the king has finally made open his designs."
"We knew it was a possibility,"
Fate replied.
"I wonder how Felix will take it."
"Let's find him first," Fletch said as he hoisted the small shield up. It was a hardy walnut targe, round and rim-shod with iron. It had a small unadorned boss in the center, with the innumerable tree branches of the Landor crest, painted in green and gold, spreading from behind it to the edges. Fletch slung the leather strap around his shoulders and let it dangle at his back. Fate looked at him worriedly. "Rather have it and not need it," Fletch said, "than need it and not have it. Although," he looked down at the dead rabbit, "didn't help him with whatever that was." He motioned with his foot to the blasted hole in the soldier. "Stay sharp, Bright Eyes. You have my back?" Fate clenched her teeth and nodded quickly. She croaked,
"Yeah."
Her longbow had been knocked with an arrow ever since they had retrieved it, but she could feel the sweat on the tips of her fingers as they tickled the feathers about the shaft. Her whole body felt as tense as the string of ivy. They left the Landoran soldier and continued deeper inward. They passed other bodies lining their path, a grim confirmation they were headed the correct way.
Toward what?
Fate was unsure, but each of these soldiers seemed to have had the same goal in mind. After swift inspection, Fletch concluded they had all been from a single unit. Each of their gambersons had the same formation of laurel leaves arranged in a pattern upon their chest. However, one body was different, yet it had not spared him of the same fate as the others. A long dark jacket of fine black leather adorned the corpse, and about the waist, a silk sash of deepest crimson red. The royal outcaster was mangled beyond recognition. The fact that it had once been a mammal at all was only recognizable because of the remnants of fur. As for the rest, it was unintelligible as to its species. Fate gagged slightly at the gruesome sight, and Fletch hurried her away.
"I can feel it,"
Fate said once she recovered from the sight of the mangled outcaster. She tugged on Fletch's sleeve, pulling him to a stop and pointing towards a building. As the blind might know where the sun is by feel, so too it was with the abundance of light. The momentous amount of light which must be supporting the massive sky vessel emanated from a large building set at the center of a sizable round courtyard they had just entered, in which many other branching pathways of cobblestone led off into the distance. The building in question was a round monument of vaulted archways and high pillars adorned with golden filigree, all leading inward towards an unseen sanctum within. For a domed, rounded roof reached high above, culminating into an imperious point, and hosted a demeanor of legitimacy and power. Fate took in the regal building of white stone and gold, yet it was the anomaly marring the picturesque sight that made her heart leap.
Fletch, over there, look. It's the rest of the ship.
The other half of the Sky Darter lay upon the ground, wedged tight between the confines of a small alleyway which led to the square. Whereas the bow of the ship had been destroyed completely, oddly enough, the stern had roughly retained its shape. A bizarre juxtaposition of breeze skimmer components displayed next to what was clearly once a fine statue of an elder Lightbearer of repute. One arm of the Lightbearer held open a book at leisure, whilst the other had been broken and was now lost.
Felix?
Fate shouted, hurrying towards the wreckage.
Felix, can you hear us? Are you there?
Fletch moved up with Fate, his posture tense and ready for the unexpected. Fate moved to the bottom of the ship and continued shouting, but no reply ever came. The way the Sky Darter had landed, it blocked all access to the other side of the street from below, and they could not see beyond the wreckage.
Should we try and go around somehow?
Fate asked, looking around the square for more adjoining paths.
What if he got thrown off the backside?
Fletch was unnaturally silent, and as Fate turned to him, she noticed the faint sign of a hasty technique. In the abundance of errant light, she could barely feel him draw upon it, washed away in the eddying tides suffusing the air. "No," he said, opening his eyes. "Look here." Fletch pointed towards the ground. There was an unmistakable mark. Something had been dragged from the wreckage. The noticeable signs ended quickly, but they pointed directly towards the large building with the archways.
Maybe some of the remaining Lightbearers rescued him,
Fate supplied hopefully. She looked around, but her heart fell as she realized she had seen no other members of her order, alive or dead. It gave her a sick feeling. She examined closely the large round square. She had been here before, in this very square, remembering she had whiled away an afternoon with Fletch not far from here, dodging whatever chores Master Silver had demanded of them that day. Now it looked odd, broken and decrepit, destroyed by the upheaval.
"I want to leave,"
she whispered. "Stay close," Fletch said. Fletch took the lead, moving cautiously towards the large domed building from which the light poured forth, and Fate followed him. As they moved under the high arches and between the long fluted pillars, the building, a magnificent work of architecture and testament to the power and solidarity of the Lightkeepers, felt to Fate more like walking into an open tomb. A long hallway wound its meandering way into the building, seemingly around a central room. Many other avenues exited from this main hall outward, adorned with long white curtains which billowed majestically and hung heavy with silver weights at their bottom. But for the main thoroughfare, it continued inwards, always curving inward. They passed slender trees set in carven alcoves along the hall. They had light-skinned bark and sent small petals of white or pink to litter the dark marbled floor. Fate and Fletch walked in silence, but silence was not abound, for there were soft sounds. The occasional squeak of leather from Fletch's newly acquired shield as it shifted upon his back, or the tension applied to Fate's longbow as she took aim down a new path that joined their hall. Also, there were words upon the air, or a chanting. It was hard to tell if the sounds were real, or merely the imagined echo from their feet softly padding across the polished floor. Finally, after many uncanny moments in the long hallway, it ended its doggedly inward spiral, and they came into a large room. The room was sparse, but massive in design. The floor was composed of tiered layers that stepped upward, and it was clear this was the inner chamber housing the dome they had seen from outside, as the roof sprung high above them in a graceful arch. A ring of decorative molding lined the edge of the room, and from the pinnacle of the arched roof reached down a solitary pillar, an ornate spiral of wrought gold, twisting round and round, hung from the ceiling, and at its center held fast a massive crystal that seemed made of pure light. Fate immediately had a sense of déjà vu, but could not place where the feeling derived from, for she had never been inside this place before. She was sure of that. At first she had to shield her eyes to the brightness let off from the crystal, but once her vision mended, she saw, there, below the massive crystal, stood a being who was unmistakable. A Lightkeeper. The Lightkeeper was very tall and stood erect. Golden runes embroidered upon sashes of white velvet broke up a cream-colored robe that reached down to the floor, obscuring its long legs. A hood pulled low shadowed the face into obscurity. However, a pair of antlers sprung high from its crown. Beautiful and majestic, they twisted and curved ornately down from the head. Along the twisting ridges of the horns, the same engraved runes seemed to flash from within with a golden light. With thin arms lifted, the Lightkeeper performed the slow, methodical motion of a technique. The effect felt like being caught in a whirlpool of light, as the energy was being supplied directly into the hearth of the massive crystal which rested above. Fate felt nothing less than awestruck. She had never actually seen a Lightkeeper before in the flesh. It was not its appearance that intimidated her, but the feeling, the culmination of light that seemed to not only surround, but consume the being. It was of the being. She swallowed hard and looked at Fletch. He too seemed taken aback and instinctively held tight to the hilt of his sword. Bereft of any elders, it fell to fate to appeal to the Lightkeeper herself. Boldly, she took a step forward into the rotunda. Her voice came out small, barely a whisper.
Lightkeeper?
She said. The Lightkeeper seemed to not notice them and continued its technique, which felt more ancient and primal than anything Fate had ever witnessed.
Lightkeeper?
She said again, more loudly, her voice echoing around the great room. The soft chanting stopped, for chanting it had been, and not an imaginary fancy brought on by the trappings of a nervous mind. The antlered head of the Lightkeeper turned towards Fate and Fletch. At first, it only stood looking their direction, while the methodical movement of its technique never ceased. Then it spoke. The words were directed at them, but their meaning held little value to their ears. Fletch raised his eyebrows and looked at Fate. "Did you understand him?" he asked in a stage whisper. Fate said frightfully.
No. Did you?
Fletch shook his head. Fate looked to the Lightkeeper and tried again.
Lightkeeper? Can you understand us? We are Lightbearers. We came to tell you Heldor, Althur is in trouble. They need us to go back. We need to help them. It's our responsibility. They are being attacked.
The Lightkeeper spoke again. His voice was melodious and resonated around the large room. Fate perked up as one of the spoken words sparked familiarity.
Yes, that's right,
she said quickly, motioning to herself and Fletch.
Children, we're Lightbearers. Althul needs us. We must go back.
Althun. The Lightkeeper's voice sounded mournful.
Yes,
Fate said. She took a few desperate steps forward in earnest.
please, we have to go help them. Do you understand? We have to go back.
The Lightkeeper's crowned head bowed, but he made no other sign he understood fate. She turned on the spot, looking towards Fletch, but was utterly lost in what to try next.
Should she approach the Lightkeeper?
The Lightkeeper's dialect was unlike anything she had heard before. It was ancient in the extreme. But an idea dawned upon her.
Writing.
Sometimes writing retained the roots of meaning. Maybe she could reach an understanding with them through runes somehow? However, before she could put this particular notion into action, a loud, heavy footstep sounded through the vaulted hall. A low, harsh laugh emanated as a black figure stepped into the rotunda. The Dark Knight, the shifter that had pursued them, stepped forward into the beautiful room of golden light. In an instant, Fate understood the sense of déjà vu. She looked up at the crystal clasped in its golden framework. The same exact formation she'd seen at Wellborough, buried under the soil amongst the twisted, diseased roots that had consumed it.
Pathetic,
said a voice, but it was not the raspy timbre Fate had heard from the shifter before. It came from elsewhere, ethereal, yet it held a terrible power behind the words.
So disconnected, your own followers can't even understand you.
At the end of a gauntleted fist, the shifter raised and held aloft that which he dragged. Prince Felix dangled limply from its grasp.
Worry not. I will make sure all know me. They will not suffer the neglect you seem so partial to.
Moan, the Lightkeeper said, and for the first time its arms halted and the technique stopped. The swirling light that was ebbing and flowing into the crystal above faltered and diminished. The air felt suddenly still and dull, bereft of life. The Lightkeeper extended out one of his long arms towards the shifter, and what had once been a gentle ebb of light became a storm of fury. The haunting laugh came again as the shifter raised the limp rabbit before itself.
They remember,
the dark ethereal voice said. Prince Felix began to yell, squirm, and thrash as the essence of the Lightkeeper poured around him. The shifter shielded itself behind the prince, and as the light intensified, a dark essence began to pool heavily in the wake of the shifter's shadow. A flash of crimson could be seen between the gauntleted hand of the shifter, as more dark tendrils seemed to flow from the catalyst jewel. They passed over the terrified prince, and eventually coalesced into the shifter's shadow.
No! Lightkeeper! You'll kill him!
Fate screamed, panic.
He's our friend! He's the Crimson Catalyst!
The Lightkeeper lowered its arm hesitantly as the screams of Felix rang around the rotunda. Then the shifter fell to its knees, swayed, and collapsed, dropping Prince Felix as its shadow took on a living form.
From the brightest light comes the darkest shadows,
the dark voice said in a twisted litany,
and from it I am come.
The shadow was no longer just a shadow, for it had a realized form of flesh. It was dark and had a hard-scaled skin, nude except for long black hair that fell from the links of its elongated arms and legs, set of a strong bestial body. A flash of sharp teeth betrayed a long muzzle hidden within the shadowed folds of a dark mane that fell from its head. The creature raised to its full height, towering above Fate, Fletch, and even the Lightkeeper, A dark violet aura seemed to emanate from around the creature, and a dread power along with it.
Deathcar,
the Lightkeeper said.
Abomination,
The dark being laughed.
What hypocrisy! Show your deluded flock what you really are. Or perhaps...
The shade rested a long-fingered paw just above Felix's prone form, curved claws ready to press down and crush the prince. At this, the Lightkeeper seemed to retreat upon itself, and for a moment, there was an unsettling silence. Then a brilliant flash came from the jewel set in the roof of the rotunda.
Yes!
The dark shade shouted as a heavy set of feet assaulted the polished floor. Fate blinked away the sudden fireflies that assaulted her eyes from the bright flash of light. As she recovered her senses, the first thing she saw was the body of Prince Felix, rolling, bump and a thump, as it dismally slid across the polished floor and fell down the tiered levels. The heavy body of the shifter had also been flung away and laid crumpled against a nearby wall. The second thing Fate noticed was the struggle of two colossal titans. The Lightkeeper was no longer the tall, thin being in cream-colored robes. Instead, from beneath the ripped hood, a pointed muzzle protruded with sharp white teeth. Its robes had ripped as it had grown in size, and they hung in tatters. Blonde white hair sprouted from the rents in the fine fabric. It was clear at a glance that it was akin to the dark shade which had formed out of the shifter. Where the shade was dark, the Lightkeeper was bright, but no less terrifying. The long antlers from its head shone with a golden fire as it fought and struggled with the dark shade. Snapping jaws and rending claws hammered at one another as the two apex titans struggled for dominance. The beautiful rotunda crumbled under their fervent administrations of violence. Fate was stunned. Her entire body felt as if it was rooted to the spot, despite the niggling sensation of imminent peril at being trampled. She looked on with a disconnected air and watched dully as Fletch dove between the stamping paws of the Lightkeeper and Shade as they struggled hotly in the throes of a deadly game. But his bid was to retrieve Felix. The sight of the fox kneeling to pick up the young rabbit, towered over by the colossi, sent a bolt of electricity through Fate, and the spell of inaction was broken. Finally, she rushed to help Fletch. They dragged Felix up, who seemed to still be alive, and gave a pained wince. He looked wildly at them for a second, but hobbled away under their direction. There was no discussion needed. The only path viable was away, to flee, anywhere but here. They had just nearly made the entrance to the hall when there was a sickening crunch and a thrashing sound. The three turned around and saw the Lightkeeper, its long antlers held fast by one dark clawed paw, its head twisted unnaturally sideways, with the dark jaws of the Shade clamped around its throat. Tremors racked the body, and it convulsed horribly as the Shade's cruel jaws pulled away with a terrible splattering as blood drenched down the white robes and viscera hit the polished floor. The Lightkeeper's body went slack as the Shade gave a triumphant, guttural howl of victory. The sound echoed endlessly around the chamber. The Shade released the Lightkeeper, whose corpse fell to the floor in a clattering of horns, now dull and dark. The Shade slowly turned its gaze upward and lifted its thin, elongated arm towards the beautiful jewel crystal at the center of the room. The last thing Fate saw as Fletch hurried them on was the clawed black paw of the Shade caress the white crystal, and from within, an inky black miasma began to consume the pure crystal. A few hurried steps past the large archways and into the courtyard Prince Felix spoke. "Let me go. I can walk," he said, raising his head after quick glances at Fate and Fletch on either side. Fate let the prince go hesitantly, but her paws lingered close to his back, ready to catch him if he should waver. Felix swayed on the spot for a heartbeat, then took a few steps forward under his own power. "What happened in there?" Fate asked. "Are you all right? Did it hurt you?" Felix turned towards them. "It hurt," he said, "but not like before, when Soraya trapped." The rabbit shuddered visibly. "That thing in the catalyst. No, it felt like it passed through me, as if an icy breeze." "And the ring?" Fletch asked. "I still have it here," Prince Felix said, holding out the crimson catalyst. "There's something different about it, too. I can feel it. Not like before, where it felt like an endless void, as if every terrible feeling found purchase there." The prince chewed on his lip. "There's something there, but it's not so foul as before. It's hopeful almost." "You're not making any sense," Fate said, looking at the prince as if he'd gone mad. "Oh, I know," Felix complained. I can't explain it any better." "Perhaps now is not the time for it," Fletch said, glancing up. The night sky, which hitherto had been awash with golden light, was beginning to change. Where once a soft radiance covered every surface, now a sickness seemed to have taken root, a darkness strangling the soft light at its edges and slowly consuming it in a hazy, violet miasma. As if by command, the hull beneath their feet gave a shuddering tremble, which shook planes of glass in the nearby structures. "We have to get out of here," Fate said desperately, glancing over her shoulder at the entrance to the rotunda. "There must be another way to get to the ground. Controls, or another ship. Something." "I may have a solution." Felix was looking around, slightly lost. "When I landed—" "Is that what you call it?" Fletch chimed in. "Before the shifter grabbed me," Felix grimaced, "I was examining the damage to the breeze skimmer and noticed a ballast was still connected to the stern of the ship. We could fashion it onto something and use it to get to the ground. It might take a while for it to deflate, and there would be no steering, but it's better than staying here." "Well, it's something," Fletch said, scratching idly at his scruffy jaw. "I must have passed out," Prince Felix said, looking around bewildered. "I don't know where we are or in what direction the ship landed." "Crashed," Fletch corrected as he pointed towards the opposite side of the courtyard. "We saw the wreckage. It's roughly in that direction, down one of the streets." "Let's hurry," Fate said, taking a few jogging steps forward. "It might be my imagination, but it feels like we're losing height." She looked nervously at the sky. "If this ship acts like a giant breeze skimmer, it will need the light. And if—" Her words held an ominous air, and Fletch cottoned on quickly. "Best be gone before then," he said quickly, following her. They had taken no more than a few hasty paces into the courtyard, towards where they had last seen the remnants of the Sky Darter, when a voice as cold as winter night echoed across the otherwise hauntingly quiet space. "Stop!" They turned to see the hulking form of the shifter remove itself from the shadows of the inner sanctum. The dark night was still menacingly large and wielded its black blade, but somehow it seemed diminished. His armor looked damaged, small golden lines fractured across the dark plate from where the Lightkeeper had assaulted him. He lacked the nightmarish quality he had once possessed. Where once his skin had been awash in a dark miasma, now he only sported taut muscles of swarthy, scaled skin.
"You've not been given leave,"
the shifter said. Its voice was raspy and deep, Yet it did not echo with the unknown terror that they had once beheld. "The fury burned me," Fletch said, spinning around with a curse. "This chap's more persistent than a tell. Every time you turn around, it's still following." "We should run," Fate said in a stage whisper, backing away. "We can lose him in the city and make for the ship." Fate's advice seemed to have taken hold with the others, and they all backed away with weapons outstretched, gathering themselves before making a sprint to cover. Just as she was about to break for it, a shadow covered the stars and pale moon as something large and dark drifted overhead. It landed with a heavy crash of taloned paws, which cracked the faux cobblestones of the hull. And as the wispy clouds shifted, moonlight fell full upon. "Edek?" Fate gasped in disbelief. Her eyes began to well with happy tears, and she took a step toward the drake. Fate made to rush forward and embrace her friend, when a paw grabbed her fast by the jerkin and yanked her back. "No," Fletch hissed. "Stay back." "What are you doing?" Fate complained, struggling to throw the fox off. For the moment she had forgotten where she was and had only one goal: get to Edek. "He's wrong," Fletch said in a deadly, quiet voice. Fate heard fear in the fox's voice, and it was this, more than anything else, that broke her of the rashness that had taken hold of her. She looked with clear eyes at Edek. The drake stood golden bronze as they had seen him on the dock. The failing ambient light made his scales sparkle. Yet, indeed, he looked wrong. His visage cast the same terror as had the dark steed of the shifter, and although his body was roughly the same, from his muscular shoulders of his back sprouted two enormous black wings. They were fingered with thin bone and a dark membrane stretched between each joint. High above the drake they arched and were lost amongst the darkness of the sky, for the same inky black miasma which had once been seen of the shifter hung about them and pooled dribbling upon the ground. The once proud and sometimes haughty drake held his head at a strange angle, not erect and sharp, but instead he stared listlessly downward. His head gave small, erratic twitches, as if he were trying to throw off an annoying fly that didn't exist. A viscous black liquid oozed between his sharp bottom teeth and hung slavering from the edges of his jaw. He panted wildly with his tongue lolling out, and the once beautiful golden eyes in which one could stare endlessly were rimmed with a dark violet that now held a madness of unseeing. A powerful sadness welled up inside Fate, and the part of her that had found the briefest moment of hope was crushed once again. Seeing Edek like this was almost as terrible as the sudden shock when she had seen him fall. In the smallest of small voices, she asked her most desperate wish. "Can we help him?" But deep inside, she knew the answer even as the words left her. Those eyes held only one thing, one desire: death. Edek was truly gone. Fletch moved slowly to the side, pulling Fate along with him, and as they moved, the torturous husk that was Edek tracked their movement with the fevered desire of a predator. "Felix, we're going to try and draw him away," Fletch said quietly, his entire focus set upon the drake. "He'll rip us to shreds in open ground. Make for the ship." "Now!" Fletch shouted the last word and broke into a sprint, his ginger fur flashing quick as a spark to set fire. Fate did not hesitate and dashed after Fletch, who was running with all of his might towards a covered glass-paned building at the edge of the courtyard. She had no time to think, no time to speak. She could only follow, obey, run. The mad drake gave a gurgling, spitting scream that tore at the air with a deranged fever, and then the sound of claws digging into stone were hot upon their heels. A billowing, slavering, choking noise was right behind them as they passed between the upright entrance to the glass building. Crash! A cacophony of rubble exploded inward as the terror drake careened through the entrance after them. Fate and Fletch both covered their heads with their arms and scrambled away as falling rubble and glass showered about them. Edek's wild rampage had seen the drake fall into the floor, rolling end over end in a heap of scales and new flailing wings. Fate and Fletch sprinted away through what had once been a covered garden, crafted for beauty, sitting, sunlight, and quiet. But the drake was none of these things. He scrambled back to his feet, the black wings flaring as he swung around looking for his prey, sending black ichor into the air in a wide arc about him. The building, which was primarily made of glass and a light iron framework, started to dither as the damaged entrance strained under the weight. Glinting daggers of deadly glass fell from on high as Fate and Fletch ran, jumping over benches and smashing through once carefully tended flower beds. Fletch in the lead was no more than a blur as he zigged and zagged, trying to find any obstacle that would create distance between themselves and the drake. In an incredible display of athleticism, he wholly leapt over a small bridge and railing which passed over a tiny waterway which wended its way through the sitting garden. Fate, however, wasn't as lucky. As she surmounted the bridge, her foot found bad purchase and her toe caught the edge of the railing, sending her head over tail into the small river with a splash. Fate landed hard. Her breath was driven out of her. Although she could not breathe, her instincts drove her and she was barely able to scramble underneath the small stone bridge as Edek's nightmarish form came down from above. He was upon her, and she pushed herself as deep into the tiny crevice beneath the bridge as she could go. Edek's slavering jaws slammed up against the hole in the rock bridge, snapping and biting, trying to grab hold of Fate. His hot breath steamed the water, and the space underneath the bridge became hot and smelled of brimstone. Edek slammed his massive bulk against the bridge, which bucked upwards with a cracking of wood and crumbling of stone. The drake heaved and tore at the ground with his great claws, pushing himself deeper into the tiny hole. The flesh of his muzzle was torn open as the greedy jaws of death snapped wildly. Fate was completely terrified and trembled uncontrollably as she saw her end inching closer and closer as the stone, earth, and wood quailed before the tyrannical might of the drake. Tears leaked from her eyes as she shut them, unable to face her friend this way, unable to face her end. Suddenly, Fate heard a muffled shout ring out through the layers of dirt, stone, and snapping jaws. It shocked her eyes open as Edek's terrible maul was withdrawn hastily. She saw the drake spin around in a thrashing motion, jumping and flailing about with wild abandon. As the drake turned his back to her, Fate saw Fletch astride him, settled between the two wing joints with his sword swan alight with a cold, white fury. The fox was hacking and stabbing with his sword, and the black ichor tainted all in a wide, splattering pattern as the drake tried to dislodge him. With a vicious roll, the drake overcame the stubborn fox, crushing him beneath his heavy body. Fletch yelled as the heavy drake landed upon him, but he screamed when the drake caught him between his murderous jaws. Edek thrashed his head from side to side, ravaging the fox. The huge jaws champed and stamped, with Fletch pinned between teeth the size of daggers. On one arm, Fletch's walnut shield was trapped between his body and Edek's teeth, whilst with the other he valiantly tried to smote the face of his foe. Yet his blade glanced off the hard scales of the drake, and his effort ended as Edek shook his massive head again, and Fletch faltered in more screams. Fate was mortified as she watched Fletch being savaged like the meekest prey. She wanted to help, had to help. Her weapon! Where was her weapon? The longbow was nowhere to be found. She made to crawl out from the tiny hole, which was her only safe haven against the terror before her. But she could not leave Fletch to die alone. As she pulled herself free, her paw splashed into the cold water, and ripples crested over the jewel of the lithium crystal attached by its fine chain around her paw. Then she did the one and only thing that came so natural to her. She drew upon the light, as much as she could, and infused it around the murky water at the feet of the thrashing drake. With immense effort, she drew the water upward with a technique and caught Edek full in the chest and underside of his belly. The effort nearly made her faint as the light passed through her in a rush, but she saw Edek's head snap backwards by the unexpected blow, and his ironclad jaws lessened ever so slightly around the body of Fletch. With this, the fox was able to free his pinned arm, and took Swan in both paws. Then, with a yell, he drove his sword as deep as he could into the drake. The light-infused blade burned with a white radiance, piercing the soft flesh between the armored scales and armpit of Edek. The drake screamed in stricken madness as Swan burned through his body, and from his back, where the dark wings spread, a torment of light escaped the wound in flailing tendrils of white radiance, casting nightmare shadows contrasted by his great black wings. Then, two things happened in quick succession. First, Edek in a mad rage slung his head wildly, and Fate watched in horror as Fletch was flung from the drake's jaws. The fox flew through the air and crashed through one of the glass-paned walls of the garden building and fell from sight. Second, an echoing boom resounded through the air, as if the fury had descended in a blast of thunder, and a vast tremor ran through the hull of the ship, shaking everything. After the destructive wave of the drake's rampage, and the violent trembling of the unstable hull, the slender building, beset with the beautiful gardens, had finally reached its limit. Wrought iron squealed loudly as the spindly beams above buckled and let free the remaining glass panes, which fell with reckless aplomb. Fate had just enough sense to dive back under the tiny bridge as the high glass ceiling came crashing down around her in a twisted iron heap. Felix was properly trapped. He had not dared run the same direction as Fate or Fletch, and rightly so, as the drake had gone straight for them. However, he had been taken aback by the impromptu plan, and as he veered to change course away from their desperate flight, he had been met instead by the unwavering will of the shifter. Its sword was held out in front of it, and although it had lost much of its mystique, there was no doubt that it was still a formidable foe. Large, heavily armored, and still very much dangerous. Felix drew Torrent, the aspen steel sliding smooth from the cobalt blue scabbard. The best he could hope for was to fend off the fiend long enough to make a break for the twisting streets. That prospect scared him, as he knew they were technically not streets, and, like as not, any one of them could prove false and see him out into thin air. But he could not stay here. He had to lose the shifter, then double back, find the ship, and collect his friends.
"Submit,"
the shifter said, hefting the heavy blade. The crystalline tip sent fragments of broken light dancing. "Not today," Felix said, thrusting forward Torrent in a lunging jab. The shifter's heavy blade parried the blow to the side, and Felix followed up with two more quick jabs at the joints of the armor at armpit and knee. He'd had the benefit of watching the duel between Fletch and this armored monstrosity and knew that force would not overcome it. Indeed, both blows landed harmlessly, scraping against the heavy plate, but Felix withdrew quick as a snake and repositioned, poised with the hilt of his blade close to hopefully draw the shifter into range. The shifter gave a grunt, closed the gap, and the black blade came soaring towards Felix as a fatal guillotine. The prince was just able to move to the side as the heavy sword smashed the cobblestones to smithereens. A metallic clank echoed out. However, the assault was not finished. As the prince danced away, the shifter grabbed the buried sword by the edge in his armored fist, pivoted, and sent a follow-up blow at Felix, using the hilt like a pickaxe. The prince was able to get torn up in time to block the sword, but the crossguard caught him heavily in the chest, making his eyes water as pain shot through him. The shifter yanked, and the aspen blade was nearly ripped from the prince's paws. The effort to hold on to his sword pulled the prince off balance. It was by sheer luck that Felix stumbled to his knees, as the shifter's next blow would have cleaved him in twain elsewise. The black blade sang a deadly song as it soared right above where Felix's head had been moments before. The shifter, by whatever dark command it had been given, apparently did not abdicate for hostages. Alive hostages, at any rate. Suddenly, Prince Felix felt afraid. This was no simple bout between himself and Fletch, where a mistake ended in bruised paws and a cheeky remark from the fox. This creature meant to kill him, and the reality of that sank in with dreadful purpose. If Felix was to survive this day, he would have to cross a terrible line, a line that nobody wished to cross willingly. But his choice was clear. Survive or don't. Panic began to creep in as he thought about Fletch. Accomplished swordsman as he was, and even he had been bested by the shifter. Felix had only a history of losses, first to Wrath, and then how many countless times to Fletch. He needed an advantage. He needed help. But help was not to be had. His friends had left, with danger hot on their heels, and with hopeless realization the prince understood darkly. They do not expect to survive Udek's wrath. They had drawn the Drake away deliberately, to give him the best chance at getting away. And had it not always been so, since the day he had first met them, they had nurtured him back to health, then extended that help until he was cured from the clutches of the shade. Even now they risked themselves to give him a chance to escape. Yet in all that time, they had never treated him as a burden or some kind of responsibility. Instead, they had treated him as an equal, free to make mistakes and choose for himself. He had aspired to become a Lightbearer, like them, and in this they had agreed to help as well. Something clicked in Felix's head as the shifter lashed out with a blow from his armored foot. The shifter was an adaptable foe and changed his style, using his entire body as a weapon. Then words seemed to cut through the haze of battle, lingering in the prince's mind as he strove to avoid the deadly blows. Words spoken by Soraya atop the mountain, surrounded by the healing waters of Yulfron. Dwell upon these words, and you'll understand what Imberkin gave at the first pact. They had seemed so ephemeral and cryptic at the time, but somehow they rang truer now. Change. That is what Imberkin had done. He had embraced the unfamiliar, heard the pleas, accepted something different for the betterment of Burrokin, even though they were not of his kind. It wasn't about him. The true power was the will to act. Not for yourself, but for others. Quicker than a thought, and more powerful than any feeling, Felix drew upon the light. He drew it into himself and focused it into the crimson catalyst. The bright red jewel drank in the light, not as it had before when the shade was trapped inside, as an endless greedy void, but it was keen as an edge, patiently awaiting direction. The surprise nearly floored Felix. He had never felt such clarity when directing the light, a true Lightbearer's power. He held the light, drawing more and more, as much as he could into the catalyst, until the jewel felt ready to burst. Of all the many words that he and Fate had gone over endlessly, words of the Keeper's tongue, and the various techniques that allowed the light to influence the world, one word kept coming to prominence. Fire. The one thing the light seemed to have no control over. And yet, fire made light. They were one and the same, the essence of change. It was a desperate thought, but the prince saw no other option to best his foe. With the crimson catalyst fit to burst with light, he dodged within range of the shifter. The unexpected move took the armored hulk by the smallest of surprise, and even smaller still when the prince jabbed the tip of torrent between the gaps of the shifter's armor, placing him in a position of certain death. With all the force of his will, the prince focused the light through the catalyst with intent and shouted, "Imbathul!" The effect was immediate and unexpected, as from the sky above, a bolt of lightning struck down with all the accompanying ferocity of nature's wrath. The flash of light was blinding as the bolt hit the tip of torrent and blazed through the shifter, leaving a smoking husk behind. The accompanying blast of thunder was deafening, and Prince Felix was flung back from the impact area, hitting the cobblestones and rolling away dismally. Pain assaulted the prince as he lay crumpled to the ground. In a discombobulated haze, he looked at his foe. Fire had indeed sprung up in all directions around the slumped, charred remains of the shifter's armored corpse. It certainly was a change, Felix thought. Then he lost all awareness as overwhelming pain clouded his senses. Fate was straining, pulling, and heaving with all of her might at the heavy body of Felix. She looked down with pity as she dragged the rabbit by the armpits. She had done what she could with what little water she had left in her water skin, but her technique had been far from perfect. The prince's face, arm, and entire right side was singed of his cinnamon-colored fur, and red raw skin shone out between patches of horrible blackened burns. She had been surprised to find him alive amidst the terrible fire that had ravaged the area around his body. She counted herself lucky after seeing Felix's burns. Once she had dared venture out from underneath the small bridge, she had found the spindly building in total wreckage about her. The impact had left a gaping hole in the hull of the ship that receded into the dark bowels below, full of metal contraptions and moving parts she didn't understand. Fate had looked down into the hole with trepidation, expecting to find the body of Edek, but no sign of the Drake was to be had there or anywhere else. Once she had seen the complexity of the moving parts hidden beneath her feet, Fate suspected some unseen mechanism had ruptured, and that is what had sent the tremors through the hull of the ship. Where the vibrations had seen fit to topple her building into rubble, here it must have burst outward in flames and taken the shifter and Felix from underneath unexpectedly. The terrible fiend had been consumed by the fire, and yet, somehow, miraculously, the flames had spared the prince. Fate struggled onward in a hurry. After the blast that had racked the ship so violently, there was no denying now that the sky vessel was losing altitude. A worryingly current of air rushed about the courtyard in a decidedly downward trajectory, if the retreating clouds above were any measure. Whatever the shade had done to the crystal, it was affecting the ship's mechanics, and that gave them little time to secure a way to escape. In the absence of a steady supply of light, the sky vessel seemed ready to tear itself apart. A sound from the shadows made Fate draw up short, and she looked around in panic. As thankful as she had been to find Felix, it was not he she had been desperately searching for when she came across the prince's burnt body. "Fletch!" Fate called out, when she saw a ginger paw struggling to push rubble away from his prone figure. Fate doubled her efforts, dragging the prince closer to the weary figure shifting rocks. She deposited him down as carefully as she could on the ground, then turned to help Fletch. Fate froze in horror when she saw the state of him. Fletch was injured badly. Worse than any creature Fate had ever seen that wasn't already a corpse. She knelt beside him and hurriedly examined him as carefully as she could. His coat was ripped apart and his chainmail was split. The riveted rings hung in tatters atop his padded shirt. A worryingly amount of the fox's lifeblood stained the iron rings and was pooled thickly upon the ground in a dark puddle. A long gash ran across his chest, down around his ribs, and towards his back. Fate's paws trembled as she touched the wound, and found that his skin and fur had been ripped from the muscle and now hung limp as a pelt rug. A terrible wheezing whine came with every breath Fletch took, and yet somehow he grinned half-heartedly when he looked at Fate.
"Scaly bastard," he said haltingly. "He finally got one over on me."
Fletch coughed, and blood gathered at the corner of his mouth. Fear flooded into Fate as she began to draw upon the light. She had no more water to use, and as uncouth, as loathsome as it was, she infused the copious amounts of blood pouring from the fox to facilitate her technique instead. He winced, shutting his eyes to the pain. An awful moan escaped him as he bared his canines in a snarl as his breathing became rapid and tense. Fate's paws trembled as she worked her technique, running them over the wound again and again, drenching his fur in crimson.
"Cassie?"
It wasn't enough. The wound was not healing the way it should, and yet Fate didn't stop, couldn't stop. She tried to be strong, tried to be brave, keep focused, but fear ate away at her, a slow creeping poison. Her vision obscured as tears formed at the corner of her eyes and gently soaked into her fur. She desperately tried to hold them back. She poured more light, all the light she could summon, into the technique. It surged through her body as a conduit until she felt dizzy and lightheaded from the effort. And still she didn't stop. A painful lump formed in her throat, making it hard to swallow. A whimper escaped her, and her body shook slightly as fear began to overwhelm her as she worked the wound. She was on the very brink of collapse when a voice cut through the fog.
"Cassie?"
Fate felt a paw gently grasp hers and forcefully bring her technique to an end. She looked up frustrated at Fletch, angry he had interrupted her. Then she realized what he had said. He had used her real name. He had not done that since she had become a Lightbearer, since she had been given her Lightbearer name. Fletch naturally had thought it a silly tradition. He had one too, of course, but as with most things, it had held little account with the fox and was now lost to time. Yet, despite that, he had always called her Fate because he knew it meant something special to her. But in this moment, Fletch was not speaking to a Lightbearer.
"I love you,"
Fletch said slowly. Pain colored his voice, and his breathing was laden with labored winces. Yet his expression was soft and kind when Fate met his brown eyes. He glanced down at her blood-stained paw in his.
"I just thought you should know."
The breath left Fate in a small gasp. This declaration scared her more than any of the nightmares they had faced in the past few hours. Her own feelings had slowly manifested themselves, but hearing it spoken out loud from him made it real in a way nothing else could. It solidified dreams into an undeniable reality, and despite their situation, she couldn't help but smile as her heart filled with love at the affirmation. Tenderly, she placed her paws on either side of his angular face in a gentle embrace. Then she kissed him softly on top of his muzzle and placed her forehead against his.
"Idiot,"
she said quietly, nuzzling him.
"Me too."
Fate stayed embracing Fletch, swaying slightly as the ship shifted underneath them, cherishing the closeness of him. The sky lost the last tint of golden light as darkness swelled and Fate closed her eyes. It was okay, for nothing else existed to her in that moment. Her heart was content, and for the first time, devoid of fear. Fate gently collapsed against Fletch, as exhaustion finally exacted its harsh toll upon her, and she drifted into the darkness of unknowing. End of Part 1. Epilogue. The Pact. The captain of the White Wind was unhappy, a wolf standing upon the deck of his ship with arms crossed, appraising the unnatural sight which lay before him. The wolf wore a long black jacket of fine leather, in which his bright silvered fur made marvelous, striking contrast, and about his middle was a sash of deepest crimson silk. The whole affair had been a hasty mess since the stranger had come to him. However, they had made a very compelling argument, one he couldn't ignore. They had known information they had no right to bear, and it was this that had moved him and his crew into action. About him, the frantic movements of his crew rushed about, attending to the controls of his breeze skimmer with aptitude. His ship had suddenly gone into unnatural turmoil as the enormous sky vessel they were trailing had begun to lose altitude. They had all seen the lightning strike the sky vessel ahead, and what was the manufactured cleverness of a ship, no matter how large, against the wrath of nature? As a result, it was now falling at an alarming rate. If it had not been for the stranger, the captain would have broken off the pursuit and let the vessel land wherever the goddess willed it. However, the one stipulation the stranger had had was that they accompany the crew upon the ship. The wolf glanced to the side, where the cloaked figure of a tall being stood observing the horizon and the sinking sky vessel with intense intent. The captain had his suspicions of what they were when he had caught a glimpse of their long white hands that every now and again were exposed as the turbulent wind tore at the folds of their cloak. He did not feel the need to expose anything too rashly, however. Surprise and concealment of one's knowledge had been the resulting factor in many a conflict he'd been part of. If the stranger turned out to be a honeyed viper in waiting, well, he knew what to expect. "You're sure of your claim?" the wolf asked. "That we will find the prize aboard?" A set of long white fingers disappeared beneath the folds of the dark cloak as the stranger turned to the wolf. "I am, Captain," said the cloaked being. "You'll find that I rarely utter falsehoods." A yell from the bow of the ship interrupted loudly. "Hoy! Off the bow! Starboard side!" The captain left the cloaked visitor behind and moved quickly to the starboard side of the White Wind and looked over. "Bring us up alongside and match the descent," the captain yelled orders. "Reelers, get down there quick. If you damage the goods, I'll have your hide for rugs." 3 rabbits with a rather wild look about them were seen, quick as a flash, running from the stern of the ship, then, with amazing grace, leapt from the edge. Tethers whined as the ropes about them let out slack and the crew aboard managed the machinations that kept the divers from plummeting to their deaths. There was a tense moment of silence and trepidation as the crew watched and waited. Then another call went up.
Retrieve!
The crew that managed the reeler's contraptions were sent into a flurry of motion, and the mechanisms were put to action once more. Slowly, the captain watched his crew ply their trade. His methods were quick and proven effective, and kept him in favor with the powers that be. The spools of the reeler's contraptions whirled loudly as the first of the reelers came aboard, hauling behind them their catch. What they had risked their discovery for. Their prize. The other two reelers surmounted the edge of the ship and also laid down their retrieved haul. The captain walked forward, and the crew made way for him as he looked down upon their fortune. A very bloody ginger fox, a petite white rabbit, and a burned prince with cinnamon-colored fur. Take them inside. The wolf stuck his paws deeply behind the waistband of his crimson sash. And take us home. Vladimir Hemmings looked haughtily towards the entrance of a dark, yawning archway. The ship he had arrived on bumped against the beach as the waves carried the small vessel against one of the smaller islands of the broken shore. The king looked around at the devastation. For all the reports he had been told about sky vessels and temples flying, until one saw the remnants of building masonry and twisted iron strewn about in a place it had no business being, on a spit of an island. It was hard to believe until now that he had not been given lies. But there was no mistaking that something vaguely resembling a Lightkeeper temple must have crashed here upon this island. The king walked forward resolutely towards the dark archway. Its twisted frame opened deeper into a structure that looked as if it could have been a cave, but was clearly once a building, now mangled in its wreckage. Vladimir passed into the deepening dark without fear, flanked by two guards who looked less than happy about their lord's enthusiasm to explore what felt like a tomb and needed to be left well alone. One of the guards carried a torch in one paw, while the other had a short bow fitted with an arrow. The building was damp and had already started to resemble a cave as the sea's wetness lingered upon everything. The tiny torch had a hard time piercing the blackness that was absolute as they left the light safety which shined through the open portal that led to the sea. Their footsteps were loud and echoed against the walls as they walked. Then, suddenly, they came to a stop as the torch's light lingered upon a disturbing visage. Something was suspended from the rafters, or roof of this haunt. The light did not reach up high enough to see the entirety of this hanging thing, but one imagined they could see long, damp hair, a sickly blonde white of color, hanging down with tatters of some sort of cloth. A twisted totem of warning, perhaps. As they turned from this ghastly sight, they realized a presence was among them. They felt it, more than what eyes saw, as the torchlight seemed to not be able to penetrate upon the presence.
Have you come to meet your doom?
A dark voice said silkily. A sheen of dark hair swirled and glistened in the shadows, and a glimmer of white, sharp teeth could be seen flickering in the torchlight.
Monster!
Yelled the guard with the bow.
Get back, me lord!
The archer's bow twanged as he shot into the void. The arrow disappeared into the blackness as a sharp hiss released from the presence. Suddenly, a long black clawed paw reached out and grabbed the archer. The rabbit was crushed into the ground and pulled violently into the pitch, leaving only a streak of blood and an echoing scream behind. Another hiss issued forth as the presence turned its focus upon the king with unseen eyes.
I am Vladimir Hemmings, the king stated. I am the king of Yonder.
King,
mused the velvet blackness.
Yes, I rule this land, and I desire to bring it order,
Vladimir said.
I came here to find the Lightkeeper and bring their uncouth ways into check. Are you them?
A laugh more deadly than any threat issued forth with a dark intent.
Order, you say?
The voice sounded amused.
At what cost are you to achieve this? At any cost, or means I must,
the king stated.
Is that so?
Asked the voice.
It is so,
the king affirmed.
Then why stop at king?
The abyss asked.
When you could be sovereign over all.
The long-clawed paw reached out from the blackness. It was coated in blood and gore stuck to the black hair, and in its offered palm lay a jet black jewel. Acknowledgements. To EGR, the one person with unshakable faith and unbreakable support, without whom this book would not have come to be. Thank you. Thank you for listening to this audio recording of Lightbearer by J.A. Hawk. If you enjoyed this production, consider supporting the author's work. Your support goes a long way in helping independent artists with projects like this one. Paperback copies of Lightbearer are now available for purchase through Amazon.com. And for readers who prefer a hardback version, they may be purchased through BarnesandNoble.com. Follow the links below or scan the QR code to pick up your copy of Lightbearer today.